Hi, welcome to Slicing and Dicing Your Audience, how segmentation spices up your marketing. There are a few different phases to segmentation implementation. So you may be familiar with segmentation a little bit already, or maybe an entirely new concept to you, or maybe you're a segmentation professional. But the way I see it, there's a kind of crawl, walk, run ramp up to using all of the different aspects of segmentation that you can in Marketo. So we'll kind of go through the different components this way. Crawl, as I just said, we'll start with an intro to segmentation and how you can use it for targeting. More of an intermediate level would be using it for dynamic content and for snippets. And then run is for advanced operational use cases to leverage the most powerful parts of segmentation to really power your marketing engine. So phase one, intro to segmentation. So what is a segmentation? A segmentation is essentially a group of lists controlled by hidden smart campaigns to route every single person into the database into the best fit segment based on both smart list criteria and segment hierarchy. So when you create a new segmentation in Design Studio, you will define smart list criteria for each of the segments that you've created. And then you will also prioritize those segments into a hierarchy. So if someone were to meet the criteria for more than one segment, then they would only qualify for the first matching segment, kind of similar to how cascading logic works when you add a bunch of choices to a flow step in Marketo. Just the first matching choice applies. You should be very thoughtful when you're creating segmentations to make sure that you are setting that hierarchy appropriately. Segmentations always process the entire database. There's no way to exclude any person in your database from the segmentation. If they don't meet any of the criteria for the segments you have identified, they will fall into this default segment that comes with every single segmentation. You will always see this. You will never have to create it. This is just everyone that's more or less left over after your criteria has been applied. Some common use cases for segmentations for targeting are for marketable leads. So what you see here is our marketable lead segment. This gives us the ability to include this segment filter on every single one of our program templates that sends an email. So whether it's an email blast template or a webinar event program that has a smart campaign that sends an email, all of our smart list criteria always includes this marketable leads as marketable leads. That makes sure that we're excluding any of our internal test leads, any of our competitors, but it also ensures that we're not including people who are unsubscribed, marketing suspended, email invalid. Now, obviously, Marketo does not allow you to send to those persons by default because those are system fields. They will always be excluded from sends. We like to exclude them so you get a better idea of how many people your email is actually going to before you execute it. And it's just kind of a fail-safe to have in the background. Also, if you have any custom criteria that you would want to exclude, or if you have any custom criteria that you would want to use to exclude people from receiving an email, perhaps you have a list of companies that you don't want to send to, or there are certain job titles that you will never be able to sell to, so you certainly don't want to market to them. You can include that in your marketable segmentation, and then as long as you're using that segment, they will be excluded from sends. This also gives you the flexibility to change what your marketable criteria is over time without having to roll out a big change to the team who's building campaigns in Marketo. It's likely, at least several people that are building campaigns in Marketo, and it's easy. It opens up a large margin for error to have to introduce a process change like that. This gives you a really easy way to, as the marketing operations person, just keep the segmentations as up to date as possible without having to change process for several persons on your team. So here's some handy segmentation tips if you're building out your first segmentation. As we mentioned, a segmentation is essentially run by some hidden smart campaigns that are sorting people into lists in the background in Marketo. If you have a large database, I would say over a couple 100,000, then I would do everything you can to approve a segmentation at the end of the business day. Even better if it's the end of the business day before a weekend. It can take quite a while for a segmentation to become fully approved. I'm sure you've seen that little green circle waiting for the segment to be finally approved before you can see how many members have been sorted into each segment. If you can, do that at a lower volume time for Marketo, it'll process a little more quickly, and it'll be sure that it doesn't create a campaign queue or cause any hangups for the rest of your marketing activities that are running. Also, be really thoughtful about how many segmentations you're building and why they exist. If you have segmentations in your instance that aren't used or haven't been used in a long time or are only used by like one or two things that aren't very important, consider unbuilding those. You just have to remove all the references and unapprove it, because you do have a limitation on how many segmentations you can build in your instance. I believe the limit is 25. You may have a slightly different limit depending on your Marketo contract. But if you run against that limit, it can be quite frustrating to try to determine what segmentations you don't need anymore. So it's better to do that as you build. Make sure you're only building ones that are very, very useful and can are best accomplished by segmentation. If you have, just need to kind of query your database and what to see how much of your database matches different pieces of criteria, you may be able to just do that with a smart list. If it's not something that you'll be using for targeting all the time, it's not something you need for any operational architecture, you're not doing dynamic content with it, it may be better to just use a smart list for that, particularly if it's not something that you will use often. So here's an example of how you can use segmentation for targeting. We include this marketable lead segment in every single one of our email send templates. As I mentioned, anywhere that we're sending an email, we include that marketable leads is marketable. And we include it as a placeholder in our program template, so it's not something that can be easily forgotten on the send. This just, again, gives us a clear picture of how many people are about to receive an email, and make sure that we're excluding any people that we definitely don't want to market to. All right, after you've become more comfortable building segmentations, you have some built out, you're using them for targeting, now you can get into some more of the fun parts of segmentation. So dynamic content. Dynamic content is certainly one of the more powerful features in Marketo. It gives you the ability to leverage a segmentation to serve custom content in the same email to different persons in your database based on what segment they align with. So one example of this would be if you have a job function segmentation. Perhaps in an email send, you would want to tailor a piece of content you're promoting to a particular job function. So in this email send, as an example, for our executive job function or our C-level job function, we served a content promo for building out your MOPS team, how to structure your MOPS team, how to know how many people you need to hire, that kind of thing. Where for our IT titles, we served a piece of content that was promoting how to evaluate a marketing automation tool, something that was much more relevant to them. They really probably don't care about building out a MOPS team. It's not their responsibility. It would just be ignored. But you can use this to customize those content promotions to make sure that you're serving content that's really relevant without having to invest in a more sophisticated tool like Content AI. This is a great way to do kind of a proof of concept for using Content AI, is doing some of these more customized content promos. Another great use case for segmentation, or for, dynamic content in an email is localization. So if you serve multiple languages and are sending emails in multiple languages from your instance, and you have the ability to align those to send, one global email, for instance, instead of constantly building separate campaigns for your German market and your English market and your Spanish market, then you can create a language segmentation in Marketo that sorts people into their preferred language. I always like to give priority to however someone may indicate what their preferred language is, but use as a backup a geo or region to make a best guess at what someone's language is if they have not indicated that to us directly. Then you can take that language segmentation and make every component of your email that has text in it dynamic. Again, you just need an editable section. And then you will click on the editable section and select Make Dynamic and select the segmentation that you want to use. In this case, it would be your language segmentation. And then for your German segment, you will populate German text. For your English segment, you'll populate English text, etc. If you're going to do that often, then I would certainly recommend building that into your program templates. You have a series of German tokens that populate your German segment in the dynamic content, and English tokens that populate your English segment dynamic content, etc. Another way to use dynamic content is in a snippet. So a snippet is just what it sounds like. It's a little snippet of code that you would use in an email or in a landing page that lives inside Design Studio. So this is an asset that you would use over and over in multiple places. A great example of this is a footer, or maybe some disclosures that you often have to use in an email send, or that you include in every email send. You would just build that in Design Studio. You would take the HTML from your email that you're about to replace with the snippet, copy and paste that into a new snippet in Design Studio, and you can make that snippet dynamic. So let's say that for your footer, you work for a global organization that has offices all over the world, and you want to show the address of the office that is closest to the lead that you're sending an email to. So for all of your leads that are in EMEA, let's say you want to show them a London address. And for all of your leads that are in the US, let's say you want to show them a San Francisco address. You can very easily do that with dynamic content inside the snippet that you've built in Design Studio. And then if anything happens, like for example, your company phone number changes, rather than having to hunt down every instance of your company's phone number in the footer of any email that's still being sent out, you can update it in one place in the snippet in Design Studio, approve the snippet, and then it will cascade down to all the email assets that reference that snippet in your instance. Same with the disclosures that you may need to include in email sends. If you live in or if you work in a highly regulated industry like healthcare or finance, you probably have some amount of disclosures that need to be included in your email sends. And you may have even run into the nightmare that is legal calling you up one day and saying, hey, we have a modification to our disclosures. Now, instead of having to hunt that down everywhere that those disclosures are referenced, you can just update your snippet, and then that will cascade down to all the emails that reference the snippet. So you've built out your first segmentation, you're using it for targeting, you have some segmentations that you're using for dynamic content, and you want to really squeeze the most you can out of how to use a segmentation. So let's talk about some of the more advanced ways that you can use segmentation. You can use segmentation for operational architecture. Remember at the beginning, we talked about segmentation being one of the most highly prioritized operational processes in Marketo, meaning that after segmentation has been approved, if a lead takes an action or a data changes on a lead that would cause them to move from one segment to the other, that happens very, very quickly in Marketo. And you can leverage that feature to really robustly architect some of your operational architecture. One of the ways that I really like to do this is with a traffic director, or a nurture router is something else you may have heard it called, leveraging a segmentation. There are a couple of reasons that I think this is really valuable for nurture. One, it gives you the ability to see at a high level how much of your database is currently part of an engagement program and how much are you currently leaving out. You can look at all the people that are in your default segment and determine if they are people that you shouldn't be nurturing, or if they are people that are just currently missing a nurture and you need to build one out for them, or find a nurture that is a good fit for them and change your criteria. You can build your nurture criteria as part of the segmentation, and then that gives you the ability to trigger off of those segment changes to very quickly add or remove someone from the correct nurture. So what we're listening for here is when we're adding someone to a nurture, that their segment has changed and that their new segment aligns with the nurture that this smart campaign resides in. So if someone's nurture segment changes and their new segment is the global customer nurture, we'll be listening for that and then add that person to the global customer nurture with a smart campaign when that happens. If their segment changes and they're currently active in the global customer nurture, but their new segment is anything but global customer nurture, then we will listen for that and pause them in nurture at that time. This gives you the ability to move people very easily from one nurture to the other without ever having them being in conflicting nurtures. It really simplifies any of the logic that you may be currently using to exclude persons that are already in a nurture from being added to a new nurture. I've seen a lot of different ways to do this, but this is by far the cleanest way that I've seen to execute this. Another way that you can leverage this kind of functionality is for privacy compliance architecture. I think everyone probably still has a little bit of PTSD from May 25th, 2018. As well as the date that Castle rolled out in, several years before that. And I'm sure another one will be coming down any day now for California and for any other states and countries that decide to follow suit in the data privacy revolution. As you know, it's very, very important to make sure that your leads are sorted appropriately into the correct country or region to make sure that they are aligned into the correct data privacy policy. It's a delicate balance between making sure that you're in total compliance with the law while not over unsubscribing your database, or unintentionally applying GDPR explicit opt-in logic to persons who live in the US, for example. That would be overly limiting to your marketing. What we do is use a segmentation to route people into the best privacy law. So there's a segment that aligns with each of these privacy laws: a GDPR segment, a CASL segment, a CAN-SPAM segment, etc. We also have an embargoed segment that is for countries that you would never be able to sell to. Then it doesn't really matter what their opt-in criteria is. We'll just unsubscribe those persons automatically. What this does is it gives you the ability to, first of all, sort those in order of priority. So let's say if you're a very have a very conservative legal team, they would say, if any of our country fields indicate that they might be in a GDPR country, let's make that the most highly prioritized segment to ensure that we're definitely not contacting those people unless we have an explicit opt-in. And if that ever changes, if someone were to move countries, or if you previously didn't know their country or were making a guess on their inferred country and now have more concrete data that you trust more, then that segment change will fire immediately, and you will be able to trigger your operational architecture off of that segment change to make sure that they are now in the best category and have the correct opt-in logic applied. And another great advanced use case for segmentation is global partition routing. So if you have ever worked with workspaces or lead partitions before, you know that it's very important to have some mechanism in place to route persons into the correct lead partition to make sure they're accessible by the correct workspace. You typically have one workspace that can access all of the partitions in your instance and observe all leads. This is where we like to build a segmentation that observes the rules for what your different partition routing should be. This gives you the ability to see all of the persons in the database and how many should be in each partition. Because again, both partitions are mutually exclusive and segments are mutually exclusive. This is a great way to kind of mirror that functionality and give visibility to people that may not have visibility into every single lead partition. That's often why lead partitions exist, is to limit the number of persons who have access to data that they don't necessarily need. Or limit access to marketing programs that they don't necessarily need, so they may not have access to the workspace that aligns with that partition. By using a segmentation for global partition routing, it also gives us the ability to reevaluate someone's partition and reassign that partition if something were to change about that person. So if you are using partitions for different lines of business, for example, if something about that person were to change and you find that they're actually a better fit for a different line of business, you could easily observe that in the segmentation and use that segment change trigger to rerun them through your partition routing architecture. Thanks so much for joining me today to talk about segmentations, and I'm looking forward to seeing you at Adobe Summit.